So for the demo, for this demonstration with Infoblox, let me just get a few things off the screen we don't need. So this is just not all of the capabilities, but the main components. So I enabled the IPAM, DHCP, and DNS. And this Infoblox is like a single node, so it's the grid master. So it's not like a complicated implementation of Infoblox. So it's meant to be kind of simple on that side, but really just to show you, how do we integrate with Ansible is the goal here. So what I want to show you first is I do have some networks in here, but when I click into them in IPAM, you'll see that when I list them out, and you can also see from this page, that none of them are allocated yet to devices. So that was one network. And then I've got the second network. So go back to the IPAM home. This 192 network is the same situation. There's nothing currently configured there. So what I wanted to do first was show you an actual playbook that will run in the automation controller to kind of bootstrap the Infoblox. So let's go ahead and go into my AAP, and I'll definitely show you what's going on in the playbooks as well. So what you see here is the Ansible automation platform. What we're using today primarily is the automation controller. This is where we manage the playbooks. So instead of like in the command line world where we run playbooks with arguments, based off of what we want to do, instead we're managing it here in the platform. So the way that we manage a specific playbook is through a job template. So what you see here is inventories. So we're going to get to the playbook here in a second. But since I'm already on this screen, I just want to show you that this Infoblox inventory currently doesn't have anything in it. So if I go into this Infoblox, there's no groups and there's no host configured. So it's an empty slate at the moment, or a clean slate at the moment. So the next thing that I want to show you is the templates. So this build is actually going to bootstrap my Infoblox, configure it rapidly so the Infoblox really has nothing in it or very minimal data in it. We're going to build a config and add some devices. And once we add the devices, we can use those hosts as a way of creating our dynamic inventory. I'm also going to add some additional attributes. So this would give me like additional variables that I can define in that inventory for requirements that I need in Ansible. So things like what type of device is it? How am I going to connect to it? Connection type, OS type, those kind of things are required in the inventory, and I can build that into Infoblox. So I'm going to go ahead and click into this template so you can see here, these are all the same types of arguments you run from the command line, but this is just managed through the automation controller. And if I didn't want to configure them through the GUI, I can actually run a playbook and configure my automation controller as code instead of building things manually from the GUI here as well. So we can run playbooks to configure your automation platform, to add new content, additional content. Now the playbooks themselves, right, they live in a separate repository. So the way that that's set up is through a project. So the project that we're using is this student project. And you can see here, let me get this out of the way, that we're pointing to this Git repo for this particular project. So a Git is just a free open source Git tool, like a GitHub or a GitLab that I'm running in my lab environment. So this gives me a Git repository to source control and manage all of my playbooks. The link that I've given you is to GitLab. So all these same playbooks are available in a public repository that you can just go to, and you can clone that down or just download those files from there and use those examples however you want. But the ones that I'm using are in my lab environment. So my AAP is integrated to use this Git repository to pull in the content. So in my situation, I'm working locally. So when I go to this screen here, this is a VS Code or a code server. It's running from the browser, and all of my files are here locally. But when I make changes to them, And if I click here in the source control integration, it updates my Git repo. So I work locally, and then I'm pushing those commits, into the Git repo, and that's where my Ansible automation platform and controller is pulling them down from. So if I was working with multiple people and we're making changes locally, then that would provide the source control management to make sure that we're not accidentally deleting files, or if we're working from separate branches, then we can reconcile that and merge our changes together into the main branch. So that's kind of out of scope for today. I just wanted to kind of give you some background of what you're looking at in the screens, but there's a lot more to that topic. So the next thing here is, let's go back and go to the template, the job template, and I'm going to launch it. So if I hit this, click this rocket right here, it's going to launch that playbook, and we'll see the output on the screen. So we'll let this get started. And this is building an initial configuration. So first was the extensible attributes, or creating like additional variables that I want Infoblox, configs that I want Infoblox to have to provide to my inventory. And then the other things that we're configuring here is some DNS zones. And then we're doing forward and reverse mappings. And we're creating a new network view. A lot of this is just there just to have a config so that we can glean it from the lookup plugins. And then host records. So these host records, and see how everything's in yellow, that means they're changing because they didn't already exist. We're just creating hosts into the system, and then ultimately we're going to use those back in our inventory. So since I ran that, let me show you real quick how it ran. So these are the files in this Infoblox folder right here. So you probably have a hard time seeing that. So let me make that a little bit bigger. So one of the things that I did here is I created group vars, and I have a group that's called Infoblox. So when I just ran that playbook, I was actually not pointing to dynamic inventory. I was pointing to a static inventory that points me to the Infoblox, because it's kind of like the chicken and the egg type of thing. So I haven't like set up Infoblox until now to be ready to be the dynamic inventory source. So when we look at this job template, and right here, if I click into it, maybe make this a little bit smaller. I went the other way right here, so you can see more of the screen. You can see when I go into the edit over here, we can see all of the different parameters. We can set that this inventory was called workshop inventory. So that was there so that I could set up a group called Infoblox, so I could set up group variables. So in these group variables in Infoblox, I had these various YAML files. So they represent the different configurations that we need in that playbook that we just ran. So this was add host. And you can see here in the add host that I'm adding switches. I'm adding 2 switches, and I'm adding 4 routers. So this configuration was pushed into Infoblox. And then these were the variables that I'm adding into Infoblox. So kind of the purpose of this is to be able to kind of prime this for the inventory. So some of the things that I need in my Ansible inventory is the Ansible host parameter, so the IP address that I need, and then also Ansible port. Now, the reason why I have Ansible port is because I'm using Container Lab for my devices, and to expose this out externally, I'm using ports. So my SSH is going to an IP address and then a port. So each one of the devices has a very unique port, so I needed to set that up. And then I also have this device type because I want to group my devices and create a group for switches and a group for routers, right? As opposed to just a default group where it's just one flat group. So I want to organize it into those 2 groups. So I have to set that up on the front end with these variables. And then we saw that we had the forward and the reverse zone. So that's how this is being configured. And then IPAM. Here, so we have these 2 networks that we're using for the IPAM, and we're going to allocate IPs from these networks to the host devices. And then view was just simply just naming a new network view called Ansible, right? So these were the variables. And then how they were configured, we created some roles. So the playbook, before we get to the roles, we go to the actual playbook down here, which is Infoblox build. And all my playbook does is it calls the Infoblox group that includes my variables, and then I'm calling roles. So each one of these roles has tasks. So if I click into one, you can see these are just tasks that are calling a module. This is a module from Infoblox. So the namespace is Infoblox. The collection name is nias_modules. And then this host record is the actual module, right? So this is a fully qualified collection name. So this namespace will point to that content that we need. And then this is the actual parameters that we're configuring. And the reason why there's the curly braces is we're calling these actual group bars, right? That's where this data is being parsed out of too. And this is how we're creating the configurations, and we're iterating through them because we have multiple hosts, multiple networks. So it's pretty straightforward. Nothing, unique with how we're provisioning here. So, so having seen that, we can go back to our job, right? And here was the build, and we can see that we had all these changes. If you want to click in one just to show you for perspective, you can see the data. And you can see in this specific one, the state's present. So we're adding a config or merging a config, right? And this was the one where we're adding a new variable called Ansible_port that we're going to use for our inventory. So to show you that we configured all of this data, and for time's sake, let me get you in here so we can do some of the other things. Okay, so when I go back into data management into IPAM, and I'll click in this 10.10 network and list it out, you can see that the two switches are now assigned these IPs, right? And from the DNS component of it, we have like the fully qualified domain name for those switches allocated. And then we had the other network. So if I go back to IPAM home and click in here, we have the routers, or in this one, we have the 4 routers and their IP addresses. Now, if I click into one further, do this and get this out of the way, right? This is like, the specific config that has been passed to Ansible. Like we'll see this comment, all this config in variables that we created, which are called the extensible attributes, have been passed to Ansible. So for Ansible to see them, we have to sync our inventory. So if I go into the inventory or run a playbook that uses that inventory, it'll sync it. So let's do that. Let me go back to templates, and I want to run this Infoblox facts, which is gathering facts from all of those network devices. And those network devices are going to use the Infoblox inventory. So that's going to require this inventory to sync up and tell us what the devices that we can connect to and configure that dynamic inventory for us. So I'm going to launch this template and go to jobs. And actually, let me see the jobs from this perspective. So we can see this inventory sync. So this is what it read in, all this information that didn't exist. If you recall earlier, we didn't have any groups or hosts. So it read all this in from Infoblox, and it's actually ran our playbook. So I'll click into the output of the playbook real quick. And what you see here is just gathering facts. So this is just gathering not all the facts, but just like the minimum facts from each device, which includes like information on like the model, serial numbers, what version of software it's running. So this was the one for router 3 is the Juniper. And then we've got, this is the Cisco There's switch 1, switch 2, and then there's a router. So this RT1. And then Arista was router 2 and router 4. So it's just, this information was simple playbook gathered facts back, but it was based off of that inventory. So let's go and look at the inventory real quick. So inventories, and I'll click over to this label so we just see the Infoblox stuff. And we click in there and we look at groups. And I have created 3 groups. Default is like the default where it just lists them all like a flat listing of devices from Infoblox. But I added those additional attributes in my inventory plugin that I'm going to show you here in a second. I configured it to create these 2 groups that were prefixed with device, and I have a routers and a switches. So when I click in routers, we will only see the 4 routers. And if I click further, you can see these variables were set for each one of the hosts. So I mentioned we need to know like what OS we're running to connect to the device. We also need to know these ports because of the way that it's set up in Container Lab. We're using a port, not just SSH. And then I'm connecting to a public IP, but this is the actual network that was allocated from Infoblox. I can use this parameter to actually create the Ansible host, but that wouldn't work in my case because I'm using the public IP and ports because this is in Azure. I can't use like I couldn't use its direct private IP address, but in a regular inventory, I would just use this parameter, and I'll show you what that would look like. So how does this all work for the inventory? So with the inventory, if I go back to the inventory, I have a source. And then I had to configure this source. So because we're running an Ansible automation platform, we have an execution environment. That's where we pre-installed all of the collections of modules that we need. So I needed that Infoblox NIOS collection because that had the inventory plugin in it. So I needed to have that available in my execution environment, which I do. And then I'm sourcing it from a project because the project gives me access to my repository into any of the content that the project has access to. So those are 2 requirements. And then I needed a credential because I have to log into Infoblox. So we're using an environment variable in I created a credential type for Infoblox. So let me quickly just show you that real quick. So when we look into, or let me search for it. Yeah, it's this one right here. This is what's important here is these environment variables. We add them into a credential, and then on the back end, the credential type will send these environment variables to our plugin. So that gives us access in the execution environment to these variables, and it's encrypted, so it's secured in the automation platform. Another alternative is you can vault this information, and then that encrypts the files. You obviously want to either do that or create a credential so that you're not. You definitely don't want to expose your credentials into your Git repository. So at a minimum, do a git ignore if you're doing like a credentials file that's not encrypted. But we recommend to encrypt it with vault or this way with a credential in AAP. So once you have that set up, you do a credential in here, this Infoblox, right? So then that will leverage that credential type. And then in our inventory, so going back into here, into the source, right? So it's been authenticated. And the other important information is where is the inventory file, the config file. So I had this Infoblox _ inventory folder that has the config for the inventory plugin and also a supplemental plugin that we use to create the groups. So there's like the default structure from the inventory plugin from the vendor, and then you can override that and create the groups to look like any way that you feel is pertinent based off of the information that's available in the inventory. So I use some of those attributes to create like the 2 different device types, the routers and the switches, because I wanted to create groups that separated my routers from my switches. So if we look into that file, so going back to here, where we were was in this Infoblox folder, And then this is on that, you can find this on that GitLab repo in that link, both of these folders. In Infoblox inventory, you'll see these two files. So this is the Infoblox YAML. So here is where we tell Ansible where the plugin is, or what the plugin is, right? So this is the plugin. This plugin is available in an execution environment because this is in the collection that's installed in an execution environment. And then this is the host. So in my private lab, this is my Infoblox, the user's admin, and then this is the password that I'm grabbing from the environment variables. So I put this in here. It's not really, it doesn't really work in my controller. I don't need this. What you would do for that is it's already there in the execution environment. You would just not have this in here at all. But if you're not running this in the controller and you're running it local, so like from, you have Ansible core installed in your environment, you would need this line here so that you would look up, what you've, set up for that environment variable, and you would be able to pull it in, using this lookup here. So either it's not here at all, and it's already in the environment, and it's going to use it when it spins up, or you call it, specifically using this lookup plugin, which is another example of a lookup plugin, being able to find information. So this was just, the environment variable that's running locally where Ansible is, or in this case, the execution environment. So we can log in, and that's very important. Now, this is the second step, is inventory groups. So with this one, it's a different plugin. So this Ansible built-in constructed. So you don't have to install this one because it's built in, but constructed will allow you to use these keyed groups. And you can see here that I created a prefix called device, and then the key is device type. And device type was read in from those attributes that were available from the Infoblox inventory, right? So I had a router and a switches. So some of my hosts were on routers, some were switches, and it just reads them in and then separates them with the underscore with either switch or router, and puts those devices into those groups. So that's how I was able to do that. So this is an important plugin to use along with any other inventory plugin. If you want to use something outside of what their defaults are, you can override them. So if that makes sense. So that's the inventory. The second piece of this, and kind of getting low on time, so I should transition. So we did the inventory, we read that in, we created a configuration, we read in the inventory. Now we have data that's available for us to search for. So one of the searches, going back into Infoblox folder, so I have a playbook that I created, and one of them is get host, and one is get networks. So in this host one, what I'm looking for is two specific hosts, the switch 1 and switch 2. You could certainly, create variables just like we did earlier to define what these are. But if you're looking for something in particular, you can just hard code it into your playbook. So this is just a way of finding specific data that's already available in Infoblox. So I want to search and check, in this case, my switch 1 and my switch 2, and make sure that it has the correct IP addresses. So to do a check, we do an assertion. So this assertion is going to look at that response that comes back, and then we're parsing to just the information that we care about, which is the IP version 4 address. So it should be 10.10.10.1 for switch 1 and 10.10.2 for switch 2. So this is just like a basic check. So this is very much in line with the drift control. So it's this is what Infoblox is saying, and then this is what was actually configured, in this case, for the inventory. I could take it a step further and actually connect to the device and see, what was actually configured on the device. But in my case, the devices are using the public IP, so that's where it kind of falls sideways. But in a normal environment that's not a container lab, you would be able to do it that way. So we're comparing what we have in our inventory right now versus what we have in the Infoblox. So I'm going to run this one first. So to find this check, I go back to my templates, right? And this is the one get host. So let's run this one. All right, so in the output here, you can see that when it used that lookup plugin, it returned this information. So it's switch.1.ansible.com, and then here's its IP address .1. And then our assertion just checks for that, and it says that one is correct. If it was something different than what we're stating for this check, then it would fail. And the failed message was that it's not correct. So just very basic. It's it either passes or fails. So we're just gleaning information and then creating assertions. The second one that I have in here is for the networks. So in this case, it's the network view. So we created a network view called Ansible. So what I want to do is I just want to print it out on the screen this time. What network views are configured currently in Infoblox. So to do that, a set fact is a way that I create a fact or create a from a variable using filters, right? It'll populate this new fact called network views. So when we get into using the lookup plugin, this is the fully qualified collection name for the lookup plugin. So it's infoblox.nias modules.nias_lookup. Remember, there's 4 different types of lookups. This one is more like the general one that goes through all those different categories. And we want to look for the network view. And the provider is just how we log in. So we already have like the username and password. We're defining the credentials. So this provider is provided through AAP, but we're just calling the one that we need to log in. So once we log into the Infoblox, I'm using additional filter that's called map attribute, because what happens is this plugin works a lot like select attributes, where it's going to provide like a list of data is going to come back for that network view. I only care about the name of that view. I only want to print out the name. So this filter allows me to further refine the output and what I want to see from that variable that I'm defining as a fact here. So when we print it out, it's just going to have the two names. So default was already in there, the view that's in Infoblox before you configure a view. And then we added one called Ansible. So we should see that on the screen. So going back to templates, and this time it's the network one. Let's build this real quick. And if it works, it should list out 2 of them. That's all I configured was the additional one. Right, so here it's just listing out default and Ansible. So the mapping showed this. Without that, there was additional information. So if I click in here, this is the data that comes back. Move that away. And we're just cleaning it up. So this one probably isn't the best example because there's not a whole lot here, but sometimes there's a lot of data. And the mapping allows us just to see what we want to see. So map is like a very important filter to list out just what you want to see on the screen, or use for comparison too. So select attributes and mapping are usually used together. This lookup filter kind of does what the select attributes normally does. So they're very important for like searching through data, finding things, and using it like for your assertions and for setting facts. It's very important for those two. So the last thing here that I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean up my config just to show you how easy that is. So I'm going to run this, and it's going to remove all the config. So how does it do that? So if we go into these playbooks that I ran, so we have the build that we ran earlier, and you can see the state_var is present. So everything that we ran earlier was present, so it's going to add it or merge it. Like if it doesn't exist, it's creating it. The clean one is running all the same roles, but with the state of absent. So it's just going to go through and delete everything, which is important like for cleanup of Infoblox to make it easy to remove configs. So when I click back here, they're all yellow because they're actually removing all these configs. And then when I go back into Infoblox, apologies, log in. And this is the last thing I wanted to show you. And then we go into our data management, into the IPAM, and when I click in this one, in list, right, there's no devices anymore. And the same thing with the this 10.10 network. It'll all be gone. They're gone in here. And then The way that you really know it's all gone to from the AAP side of things is if I go into the inventory and click in here and go to source and then sync that source, there's no configs anymore that's going to pull down. So it's going to remove all the data that was in there because it's dynamic. So I go to host, nothing's in there. Groups, nothing's in there either. So it's like a cleanup of the inventory end of the configs and Infoblox. So